Hello, everyone, and welcome to another curatorial conversation at the Walters Digital Space. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Ellen Hoobler, who is the William B. Ziff Jr. Associate Curator of the Art of the Americas. Hi, Ellen. Welcome.
Hi, Joy. I'm really glad to be speaking with you today.
And here you can see we're already going to start diving in to our object of the day and our topic of the day. What do we have here?
Yeah, so as you can see, we've got this beautifully knotted textile hat with a square crown on top and 4 protrusions around the sides. It shows 4 colored squares on each of those 4 rough sides, each with it's the imagery of a large, probably a predatory bird with a square on its stomach, maybe indicating that it has successfully caught some of its prey. So we're seeing most of the hat as it would have originally been made, but it's actually quite small. As you can see, it's only about 5 3/4 inches across. So we're probably missing a chin strap that originally would have held it in place. So these are actually so small that scholars at times have wondered whether they were actually worn by people, but it seems as though based on the fact that those that do have chin straps have signs of wear, repaired chin straps, a little bit of hair oil inside. So these probably were actually worn at one time. So although it looks as though it's in fantastic condition, it is in fact in really wonderful condition. It actually was made over 1,000 years ago by members of the Wari people in Peru.
And I just wanted to go back to kind of see the significance of conservation and thinking about how people lived. And that chin strap kind of anecdote is quite amazing. And you mentioned that this hat would have belonged to a Wari person and the Wari people. Who were they?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Here we see a map of what we would call the sphere of influence, the sphere that the Wari would come to eventually control. So I think when we think of the Andes, the Inca tend to take up most of the mental space that we have for the Andes. And yet there were many empires and kingdoms that preceded them that were also very advanced and controlled, in some cases, a great deal of area and territory. So you can see that the Wari heartland was centered on the site of Wari, the city of Wari, which is pretty close to the modern day city of Ayacucho in the southern highlands of Peru. And yet they controlled much of the coast by the time that their empire was overturned around 1100. So they controlled through amazing works of road building and terracing and water control, and also were amazing weavers and ceramicists and metallurgists as well.
That's wonderful. And thank you so much for bringing such an interesting map to kind of plant our contemporary understanding, but also what was happening at the time that the hat was created. And I'm, in looking at this hat and in talking with you and prepping for this program, you describe them as expert weavers. So do we have other examples of their work in our collection that we can look at?
Yeah, we actually have several examples, but I chose one particular one to talk about today. This is a panel, just one panel of a tunic. Probably there would have been 4 panels like this, and they would have made up a tunic by sort of folding them over and stitching partway up the sides. I have oriented this horizontally so that we can see these very stylized heads on the tunic panel, but probably it would have gone the other way and been there would have been 2 bands that went down the body of the person. So Wari, I don't want to say it represents the highest achievement of weaving in the ancient Andes, because there are so many amazing moments within Andean weaving, but certainly it's the Wari weavers were able to do an incredibly laborious and precise work. So these textiles, in some cases, have as many as 200 threads per square inch. And it's estimated that if you were to unwind all of the thread in a given Warri tunic, you might have as much as 10 miles worth of thread, which is a great deal. And that's not even taking into account the fact that you would have, needed to raise the animals, camelids, so llamas, alpacas, vicuñas. This might be alpaca. You would have had to raise those animals, tend to them, then shear them, dye the wool, clean the wool, spin the wool before you're even making that 10-mile, to just make those 10 miles of thread to weave something like this, which is truly amazing.
That's impressive. It's also interesting to think of the scale and, it's multiple uses and multiple kind of iterations of this textile throughout this time period is really fascinating. And I'm curious, going back to the four-cornered hat, how was that constructed? Was it a lot different? Were there different materials?
Yeah, so I'll just point out before we go there, I forgot to say that some of you may be looking at your screen and squinting your eyes and saying, okay, where are those heads? It's a little bit hard to see, but here you can see these faces in profile as part of squares. So Wari textiles not only are complex from a technical standpoint, but also from an iconographic standpoint in terms of their imagery, how it's compressed and expanded, how it's geometricized, abstracted. And that is something that goes across other media as well. So for example, we have this Wari ceramic vessel in the shape of a head with painted designs, where these designs on the face seem to echo that geometricization of forms in some of the textiles. So while the tunics and woven textiles were incredibly laborious, these hats were slightly less so, although still pretty labor intensive. So the process for making these are actually knotted using a knot known as the cow's hitch or lark's head. From what we know, these would have been started from the bottom up and sort of knotted from the bottom up, attaching each piece like a crochet to the piece next to it as you go along, and eventually ending up with one long band that you'll sew up this one seam on it to make that four-cornered, the four sides of the body of the hat. And then the crown would be made separately, also knotted. But as you can kind of see here, it's a little bit difficult. Please, I urge everybody to go online and take a look at this more close up on our website after our talk. You can see that there's kind of a chenille-like surface to this. It has a texture to it, and that's because not only is it knotted, but they're adding a little bit of extra fiber, probably unspun fiber, into each of those knots to give it this velvety or chenille-like texture.
That chenille texture, for folks that I feel like we do probably have some people that know what we're talking about. But it, like you said, it's like velvet, so it has a pile to it, which means it has some length to the finished product.
Exactly. Okay. And it's interesting, we've spent a lot of time looking at this and wondering, are the red fibers on those birds, are they intentionally a little bit longer? Is it somehow more difficult to work with the red fiber, somehow the red dye? Anyway, so there's a million things that this opens up that I think are really fascinating. And I think it's interesting in terms of making connections to modern day life, to everyday life, in that the lark's head knot is also the knot that is used, as I understand it, for attaching a weave to someone's natural hair. And so there is these connections of, how to make something that is going to be durable and lasting and yet shows this care and love in its making.
Mm. And I'm curious, you mentioned a little bit about the weave. Is there anything else we should know about kind of the pieces on the top and how they were woven or what they're meant to symbolize?
Yeah, thanks so much for bringing that up. So as I said, the body would be made in sort of one piece that's sewed up. The top is made in another, and often attached to that are these four little vestigial perhaps ear references, there are 4 little corners, and we're not totally sure, scholars are not totally sure what these reference, but of course, looking at it, we wonder if it refers to either the feathers of, amazing predatory birds. You have condors in this area, which are some of the world's greatest predators, or perhaps it's the perked up ears of other predators like jaguars or pumas that are also in the area. And it's interesting to note that there's all of this symbolism of predators in this, predatory animals in this hat. And these objects, when they've been found in context, are often found in the graves of men specifically. As far as I understand it, none have been found in the graves of women. And when they're pictured in ceramics, at least some of them, in the case of this large urn from Conchopata, have been shown on urns that seem to show men holding weapons. Sometimes it's men holding cups, but that may be a ceremony that's related to warfare. So we think that these are worn specifically by warriors, worn and used by warriors.
I think that's great. And I wanted to get to my question about what do the colors mean, but I also wanted to pull from the audience, if you don't mind, because I know you like to go off the cuff. Someone asked, how did they make the red dye? And was this not woven on the loom? So how was it woven? Just similar, like you said, crochet. So were the smaller pieces done on the loom, or how, if you know how they were constructed?
So there's no upright loom in the pre-Columbian world. There's much more use of a backstrap loom where the woman's own body weight provides the tension for the warp threads, the sort of structure for the textile. So it wouldn't be on a traditional loom like you may be thinking of. I believe these might have been started. There's just like a little lacy round border at the bottom that I've often looked at. I'm assuming they started on like a very thin stick. And, like a crochet hook or like knitting, you need maybe something to get started and then you can go forward. But I have to admit, that's a really great question that I need to look into further.
That's wonderful. And
so
I want to,
and in terms of red, it could well be a mixture, either natural dyes from plants or cochineal, a particular insect that grows on cacti, and provides a very brilliant and red that is a dye that is fast. It will not wash out.
Yeah, and there's a lot of great research out there on cochineal specifically. And I know we can't speak directly to what this was. It might have been cochineal, but like you said, it could have also been plant matter. And I'm curious, just to hop back into the questions, what do the colors mean? Do we know which each, and there are it seems like there's very distinctive colors that are present as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's 7 separate colors in the hat. So there's red, yellow, kind of an olive green, dark blue, turquoise, brown, and white. So 7 totally separate colors. So that also adds to this idea of how much work this was to construct, because you're separating your wool, and maybe the brown wool you're particularly using alpacas that already had a darker tone to make it a richer brown. Anyway, just to say that dyeing was really important at this time period. So people love to hear this, which is that we scholars, there's still so much we don't really know about the pre-Columbian world and works like this. So the Wari had something like written records known as quipus, but we have not been able to decipher them yet. But that's also based on a textile structure. So while I can't tell you what the colors meant, I do think that the use of the colors and the shift in colors as you move around the hat is clearly very, there's very conscious choices being made there. And I will say that Garcilaso de la Vega, a chronicler from the early 1600s, who was part priest, part of his ancestry to Inca nobility, he wrote about a Inca this quipu textile structure and said that when another Inca king was made something that he called the equivalent of a will, and that he was choosing threads in different colors to discuss his possessions and what was to happen to them. And in that case, he chose yellow to refer to gold, white to refer to silver, and red to refer to warriors. So we don't know whether those categories hold further back for the Wari, but certainly there's very conscious choices being made in these colors that are used.
And it's really interesting that you say that, because, you know, a lot of cultural things embedded in our visual culture or in our material culture shifts over time, but it would be very interesting how those connect and kind of what those new writings or newly found writings can tell us about kind of what might have shifted, or at least what was happening at the time. And it makes us, I think, feel a little bit more appreciative of the knowledge we do have, because it you know, knowledge is a little fragile, especially if we go further back in our history. And so it's great that we have this hat to study, right, amongst, and that it's in such great condition is, I think, quite remarkable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's very exciting to be able to work with the actual object.
And I'm very curious, for you as both a scholar and curator, what about this hat and the Wari people resonates with you specifically?
Well, that actually gets at something that I think that we've been talking about, and something that popped up very unexpectedly. But what I love about looking at this hat, and love considering, even though we don't have all the answers, is how this pre-Columbian identity is so, in the Andes, is so tied to textiles, and that, you know, for the Inca, we hear about people wore tunics, and just looking at them, other people would know the region they were from, perhaps even the family or clan that they were from, so that there's this very strong connection to identity. With the Wari, we have less, maybe we have a little bit less understanding of that, but as we talked about this, actually, Paloma Feliciano, our own Paloma Feliciano from the education department, when we were talking about how do we convey this idea of identity, and I said, maybe we should I can bring out an Orioles hat, and you would think about, okay, I have allegiance to the Orioles. And she said, no, wait a second, I think I've got something better. So let me just go to the next slide. She said, wait a second, actually in my family, we have some hats that are used in a dance known as the poiera. Well, the poiera refers to the skirts worn by women who do this dance. And skirts are called, these particular skirts are called poieras, but they also wear, in some cases, hats. And what I love about it is, first of all, it's a hat that has a chin strap, as you can see here, and beautifully embroidered with beads on it. And then even the crown of it has this very elaborate pattern. She said that her mother talked about this being the 8-pointed star, the symbol of the Inca. And so
it's magnificent.
I wanted to really thank the Familia Rivera Marroquin from El Colca Achoma in Arequipa, Peru, for letting us borrow the hat for this talk. Sorry, and I'm putting it towards everybody in the wrong way. I don't want to put it on because it's not my hat, but I'll just hold it over my head so you can get a sense of how this would look. What I love about this is that other people from southern Peru could probably look at this and know, okay, that's El Colca Achoma. There's still this connection of textiles and identity that is still there today, that's so strong. So I think that's just a really fascinating, that's a really fascinating feature of all of the Americas, and also something that I really argue for, that the pre-Columbian past still has a lot of resonance and importance in the present day.
Absolutely. If you don't mind, I'm going to take another question from the audience.
Oh,
again.
sure.
Allison has a really great question. What does terracing mean? Because I was reminded of this when you brought up the slide of the map. What does terracing mean in this context, mentioned in relationship to the map slide that we see here about regional control?
Yeah, great question. And I should have been a little bit more clear. So Peru, parts of Peru are among the driest, the most arid in the world. And so it's a real challenge to maintain civilization there, much less have these incredible civilizations which are supporting thousands and thousands of people and maintaining livestock and making architecture, monumental architecture and amazing weavings. So terracing was a way of controlling and channeling water so that it could be brought, the little water that there was could be moved, say, from a mountaintop where there's runoff from snow peaks and bringing it down to fields down below where it was needed for agriculture.
That's great. I hope that answers the question. I'm curious, as we move towards the end of our program, and we'll take more questions from the audience, what is pre-Columbian art? You've referenced it a few times. That's on purpose. And why was it important, and is it important to shift to talking about ancient Americas, which is something you've also name dropped in this talk? It's something I'm really fascinated in talking about holistically in museum spaces, and so I feel like it resonates with you that this is something that we need to talk about. So I'm excited to talk about it with you.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, so the department that I work for, or my sort of department within the museum, is actually, we call it the Art of the Americas, because ancient has certain connotations that the ancient world, I think, my colleagues would yell at me for not being able to give a specific date, but let's say 300 of the current era might be a cutoff point between the ancient world and maybe just the pre-modern world. So the idea, the phrase pre-Columbian, the name pre-Columbian, it's sort of been a necessary evil that we've been living with in the field, but yet it is so imprecise. I mean, imagine if we were to just talk about art and say, well, you know, it's European art. That really tells you nothing about what you're talking about, because are we talking about European art of 1000 BCE or yesterday, or what do we mean? And even if you're looking at a comparable time period, you're getting such different art. 1790, 1789 in France, you're getting art that refers to the French Revolution. At the same exact time in Russia, you've got all of these paintings that would be glorifying Catherine the Great and sort of making monarchy look like the best system of government ever. So I think one of the biggest problems with pre-Columbian is how imprecise it is. And this is something that scholars have been noting for quite a while now. My former advisor, Esther Pastori, had pointed this out, and in response to her, Cecilia Klein of UCLA had written an article, I think we have in 2002. And then much more recently, in 2019, there's a journal that did a whole issue on that got at some of these questions of naming. And I think that's one of the links in the end of this presentation, in case people want to go further on this. So on the one hand, there's this total imprecision of the term. On the other hand, it really seems to privilege the European invaders, colonial system that comes afterwards. So I'm certainly a member of even Facebook groups that are debating this right now, and what do we use instead. I think a lot of museums, including the Walters, have really opted for Art of the Americas, because even ancient Americas, people might know what you mean, but you know, is 900 to 1100 of the current era really ancient? It's really medieval, or maybe early. My colleagues would yell at me, but maybe early medieval. We did have a book by one scholar in the 40s that was called Medieval American Art, and I think it just confused more people than it enlightened. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's like the connotation, right, of what, and it brings up like visuals and very interesting antiquated ideas of how these cultures existed, what their visual culture was, what they were contributing, both in their community throughout what we now consider a nation state or a country, and of course like the world. So I think that's really apt. It kind of gets too messy, and then we don't, like you said, respect the cultures from that time having their own, of course, agency and their own ways of life.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes them seem as though there's no change across time and space, and that's really the problem with it, I would say.
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna jump right into comments from folks. People have a lot of great comments and questions, and the question from Danielle is, are there a lot of pre-Columbian textiles in the Walters collection?
We have a fairly small number. We have a handful. I would say we have about 12, something like that.
12 textiles.
12 textiles, and those are all from what is today either Peru, Bolivia, maybe Ecuador, but probably Peru and Bolivia.
And then we want some clarity on the reference of pre-Columbian, which I had the misfortune of just using. But what are we saying when we are saying pre-Columbian? What is the time frame?
Sure, that's a great point. Yeah, we didn't even start with what is pre-Columbian. My colleague Joanne Pillsbury at the Metropolitan Museum attended a symposium at the Walters last year and made the point that people under 25 think that this has to do with the modern day country of Colombia. But what pre-Columbian meant, or was the term that was referring to originally, was sort of from the beginning of time at any point in time up until about 1492 and the arrival of Columbus, hence pre-Columbian, but really until really an establishment of a colonial system. So that might have been a slightly more shifting date in some regions. There's not a colonial conquest until into the early 1500s in Peru, for example.
And I think that's why it's so messy to say pre-Columbian, right? Because to use that very particular moment in history is kind of problematic to what was happening elsewhere in, again, what we now consider the continent, and what was happening there, but both visually and culturally. So I think that was a good question, good answer.
Thank you.
I think that's all the questions that we have. I don't know if anybody else has any other questions. I did want to reference Rosano Soto's question. The polka textile was different look than the Wari, and the hat you show is more modern influence in the colonial time. And I just wanted to reference that. We were actually talking about how hats have different influences, and for copyright reasons, we could not use the Orioles hat for good reason. And so I think that's another good example. I think when we were preparing for this, we talked about college sports hats and how they have an even deeper meaning depending on what college you go to. That goes into class, of course. And that's just off of a football hat, which I know a lot of people take seriously. And so it's to kind of think about both the contemporary concepts of how hats are used and the symbolism there. I don't know if you want to speak more to that and kind of how we imbue a lot of importance into items that we wear.
I mean, sure, we're living in an Instagram culture where I don't want to say we're defining identity by our clothing and the way we present ourselves, but wow, we really do spend a huge amount of time, energy, money, and mental space in figuring out how we present ourselves. Maybe there's less emphasis on hats these days, but no, hats do pop up. And so, yeah, I'm sorry I hope I was not imprecise in explaining. This is a modern day hat that was used by the Familia Rivera Marroquín in modern day Peru. And I'm trying to go the wrong way. So this is a modern day hat. I would not be touching it and like holding it up in this way if it were not modern day. And it's in some ways, Rosana, yes, it's different, but I mean, if you were to really look at it, there's no imagery that you say, wow, that has to be European inspired. And it's really fascinating to hear that people are looking at it and are more focusing on the symbolism that is here on the crown, this 8-pointed star, and identifying that with the Inca presence. So yeah, I just I would say that we're really spending a lot of energy in that.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. I think I want to end with Amy's question because I think this could be a precursor to a whole other conversation. Her question is, or their question is, could you talk about how art changed after the Spanish conquest? And you don't have to answer that here. I just want to tease that because that is such a great question to be answered in a full program. But if you want to speak to it, you can close us out. You're welcome to.
Well, I think Amy may know better than I do how art changed after the Spanish conquest, as she's quite an authority in her own right, but I really appreciate the question. And, you know, we think of the processes of colonial conquest as being something that would be a very clear binary before and after, but that's not at all the case. There's such a long time where things there's many more motifs and techniques of the pre-Columbian past, or the pre-1530 past in the Andes. So there's a style of textile weaving that's incredibly fine, known as kumbi, that continues to be desired and collected and sought after, even in the early colonial period. Colors probably maintained their significance. We know that in the 1580s, early 1580s, there's actually an ordinance that the Spanish passed that prohibit people from wearing their native clothes, their native dress, and that's because the native clothing encodes forms of identity that the Spaniards maybe are ill-equipped to even understand, and yet one person in the Andes can look at the other and understand right away. I mean, this is something that is pretty standard across the Americas. If we were to talk about Guatemalan women and their huipil blouses, and how one woman in Guatemala can look at another woman's blouse and tell you, oh, she's from that town. That's the same thing in certain traditional parts of Mexico and many other parts of the Americas. But so in terms of how art changed after the Spanish conquest, I would say that it changed in different ways at different times and places. And it would be really hard to talk about this, but I would love for us to come back and discuss that more at length at a different time.
Yeah, especially in including our collection and how it can speak to that, or not, because it's like you said, it's a varied conversation that I think we could probably spend a lot of different programs and events talking about. And okay, we're at our close. I don't see any more questions. I really want to thank you, Ellen, for being here. I want to thank the audience for sharing some really great dialogue in the chat. There's a link over there to see the hat in full view at our art.walters.org. So be sure to check that out in the comments if you can. And I want to thank the digital team for being awesome, including that link. And I just want to thank everybody for being involved. And thank you all for such a great program and such great dialogue. I want to draw attention to the links that Ellen is sharing. And if anyone's interested, they can hit us up and we can share that with you all. Thank you so much. Everyone have a wonderful afternoon.
Yes. Lovely talking with you